Welcome. In front of me I have the Realme 11 Pro, and today I'll go over unboxing along with a quick overview of this phone. So let's just get straight into it. This is a mid-range device, so I'm gonna start off with that. And that being said, the price tag for this device is about $260 or about 2,500 or 2,500 rupees. So with that being said, let's just see what we get for that price. Okay, so there we go. As you can see, the phone is already turning on now. One thing that I'm gonna start off with is the back. It is, I presume, a fake leather, but it does feel pretty nice. It's a little bit softish. The reason I mentioned that is because I did unbox some devices that had this kind of leather look to it, but it just felt like absolute plastic. And here it actually does feel like leather, which is pretty nice. Now I do have also this strip going around. Now this is not leather, this is, as you can see, reflective is glass, I believe. Glass or plastic, either one of those. And then right here we got our dual camera bump. It's actually not a substantial bump, as you can see, very minimal. It's in terms of like how much space it takes at the back, it's primarily done for symmetrical purposes. As you can see, you have a circle right here. This is just a circle. There is no lens in here. Then we got the main lens right here, which is a 100 megapixel lens right here. And then right next to it, we have the 2 megapixel depth, which is a far cry from the 100 megapixel that is the main one. It's almost a joke. Now, that being said, the 2 megapixel depth sensor is probably useless, as it usually is. Now, usually what it is used for, or when it is used, is when you're trying to take a portrait photo and it tries to use the secondary lens as a means to define how far the subject is, and then it completely f's it up, and you will end up with having this kind of like halo around your hair, because 2 megapixels is absolutely terrible for defining such a fine detail like hair. And it's primarily being used in portrait, where you have a lot of hair. So you can probably figure out how atrocious photos could come out with. Now, if you don't see any kind of effect like this, chances are then the camera isn't really using this 2 megapixel depth sensor, and then the question is, why is it even here? Now, moving to the front, we have a very nice display. So to go into the specs of this display, we are looking at a 6.7 inch display, 1080p by 2412 pixels. It's a AMOLED display, 1 billion colors, HDR10 plus certified, 120 Hz refresh rate, and a peak brightness of 950 nits. Now, with that being said, for everyone who doesn't really speak the display terms, it's good. That's basically the gist of it. It is bright, which obviously is a good thing. It's an AMOLED display, meaning the black, anything that is black on the display will have very deep contrast, basically almost looking like an OLED display where whatever is black, it looks like the pixels are turned off. So that is also a very nice thing to have. And it is HDR10 plus certified, so obviously HDR content, no problem here, along with 120 Hz refresh rate, meaning that the display refreshes twice as often as a typical like crap device. Now, nowadays 120 Hz is what I would consider a standard. So 60 Hz is already kind of like fading out of existence. So this is what you would expect from a device, which is obviously good. And for people that don't know what refresh rate actually does, it basically increases the amount of time screen refreshes when you're, for instance, doing any kind of action. So when you're scrolling up or down, whatever, the motion from point A to point B, depending on, let's say it takes you a second to scroll like this, you'll have typically only a 60 frames between point A and point B in that 1 second. With 120 you will have double amount of frames, meaning the content will look smoother. It's kind of like stock motion image when you have like a bunch of images, you start scrolling them out, they basically look like they're animated. So imagine that and then add double the frames between those and it will look smoother. that's basically the gist of it. Now, that being said, let's move over to additional parts, which are the internals of this device. So, starting off with the processor, we have a Dimensity 7050. And for people that are interested in what this compares to, if you're like me and don't really know too much about Dimensity, this is basically equivalent to a Snapdragon 778G, which is a mid-range processor, on a higher end of mid-range, and just to point that out, and it is pretty good. So this phone should have very little problems of breezing through most of the things that you will throw at it. Now, one thing that it will probably have struggle with is if you throw Genshin Impact at this and want to run it at 1080p max settings, 120 Hz, you're not going to be doing that, just so you know. Now, with that being said, at the very minimum, this phone comes with 8GB of RAM and 128 gigs of built-in storage, and goes all the way up to 512 gigs of storage with 12 gigs of RAM. So this phone can get pretty nicely spec'd. And also, let's see if we have expandable storage right here. So we have a tray at the bottom. Unfortunately, it looks like we don't have expandable storage here. So if you need more than 128, which is the base version of it, the lowest one, then you will most likely need to buy the more expensive one that comes with, for instance, 256 gigs and also sticking with 8 gigs of RAM. Now, that being said, if you're wondering how much RAM you would need, I would probably argue that 8 gigabytes is pretty good amount. And for a phone like this, which is technically in a mid-range spec, I don't think you're gonna need much more RAM than that. But if you want to be safe, you could go for the 12 gigs, which also come with 256 gigs of storage. And that being said, obviously, the higher you spec it with either storage or RAM, you'll always need to pay more, so that is something to keep in mind. And also, additionally, certain regions might not offer like all the options. So as an example, you might see something like 128 gigs of storage with 8 gigs of RAM and 256 with 8, but then it will skip the middle portion with 256 12 and then go straight for the 512 and 12, or just not even include those. So depending on where this phone is being sold, it might vary in options that you have, but hopefully my simple explanation did kind of give you an insight what you might be looking for. Now, one thing that I didn't mention is the selfie at the front. So this device has a 16 megapixel wide sensor at the front, and with that being said, with the back cameras you can record at 4K 30 frames or 1080p at 30 or 60 or slow motion 120 and 480. And at the front we only can record at 1080p 30 frames. Now, like I mentioned, this phone does cost about $260 or about 2,500 rupees. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because there's also a pro version of it, which I haven't even gotten to, but I did check the specs of it, and the only difference between these two devices will be obviously the first one, which is the price, and the second one will be the cameras. Now this one comes with 200 megapixel main sensor, and then at the front it has a 32 megapixel wide sensor instead of the 16. So basically the two main cameras that have front and back are doubled in pixels, and that's about the only difference. Now it also comes with a 100-watt charger, but to be completely honest, 67 watts charger will be good enough, and charging your phone at 100 watts will degrade your battery significantly quicker, so it's something that you might want to stay away from in general if you want your battery to last longer. Now the reason I'm pointing this out, the differences, is because the difference in price between these two devices isn't that great. So while this costs 260 about dollars, or like I mentioned 2,500 rupees, the Pro version or Pro Plus costs about $300 US and 29,500 rupees. So it's not that much more expensive. But you also don't get much more for this device. Now, these are the primary differences between these devices. When it comes down to speccing this, at the very minimum, this device comes with 256 gigabytes of storage with 8 gigs of RAM. So this one would have half the storage when we compare the cheapest options of these two devices. So again, if you're looking for storage, and for instance this one coming with 256 8 gigs of RAM costs, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20 bucks less, probably go for this one, because it will offer, apart from the same storage at that point, it will offer you a better camera at the front and back, and also a faster charger if you choose to use this. Which, like I mentioned, I wouldn't really recommend charging your device constantly at 100 watts. So, with that being said, there's not much more to talk about this device. It's basically all the specs and all, so there we go. One thing that I didn't mention yet is the phone comes with a under-display fingerprint sensor. So if you are into that, you can obviously sign up for add your fingerprint and unlock it just by tapping on a screen. Also, it has a curved display, which is probably a little bit harder to see with a case on, but as you can see, it is curved. So not everybody will be into that. I want to mention that. Personally, I do really like curved displays on the phones, so that's definitely hitting the spot for me. So now, I basically went over everything that this device offers, so let's just recap the pros and cons. Pros, we have a charger, and it's a pretty good one on top of that. We have a nice display, AMOLED with high refresh rate, and can get pretty bright. It's nothing like competitive that could compete with something like, for instance, the top flagships of Samsung's or maybe iPhones, but it's still pretty good nonetheless. And the design on here, I personally like it. Not everybody will like it, but I do consider this as a pro. It stands out, it feels nice in hand, so it does feel premium in general, even though the price wouldn't really suggest it. We also have a pretty decent battery size at 5000 that can obviously will charge pretty quickly, and under display fingerprint sensor, which I do like myself. Not everybody will. I also want to point that out, so yeah. And going into the cons will be probably the more, actually never mind, this isn't plastic, this is actually aluminum frame, so the build won't be a problem here. But the 2 megapixel depth sensor, that's a massive L right there. It doesn't need to be included. It just adds to price while not adding you any kind of benefit. So that's definitely a con. And honestly, that's the only thing I can think about as a con to be, or actually one more. Lack of SD storage. For a phone that comes in this kind of price range, mid-range, not having expendable storage is a little bit of a shame right here. It's a missed opportunity and a feature that you would expect from a device, as well as in certain cases headphone jack. Though I could argue that headphone jacks here at mid-range price might not be as important, but expendable storage I would say still is. So there we go. Now with that being said, hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and thanks for watching.